Welcome. Today we're going to look at the life of John C. Bennett, how he infiltrated the early Latter-day Saints, how he laid the foundation for spiritual wifery, and for Brigham Young to lead the people into polygamy. Let's get into it. Hope you enjoy. How did the notorious John C. Bennett infiltrate the early Saints? When Bennett arrived in Nauvoo, the Saints were in desperate need of leadership. Dr. Bennett's arrival at Nauvoo was very timely for his own climb up the social, political, economic, and religious ladders. The Saints at Nauvoo were in a weakened and critical condition, being physically and economically drained. Joseph and Hiram and other church leaders were shackled by threats from Missouri and Illinois law officials, who were seeking to seize and return them to Missouri to be tried on charges of treason. Several thousand destitute Saints were without homes and employment, and many were seriously ill because of malnutrition, exposure, and disease. Even the prophet was not exempt from losing members of his family and strong men upon whom he was depending. No doubt Joseph's personal losses and the suffering of other saints weighed heavily upon him. A number of the members of the 12 were in England as missionaries and therefore could not provide leadership. So Joseph welcomed the assistance of Dr. Bennett, who came prescribing a miracle medicine, quinine, for the malaria which was killing the Saints, and also bringing great visions and expertise in city planning, schools, a university, commerce, a militia, a Masonic lodge, and political stability. On January 15, 1841, Joseph, Hiram, and Sidney, presidents of the church, issued a proclamation to the Saints scattered abroad, in which they revealed that Dr. Bennett had been instrumental in effecting our deliverance from the authorities of Missouri. Bennett began his spiritual wifery soon after arriving in Nauvoo. The young doctor came to Nauvoo posing as a single man and was soon engaged in secret illicit sexual activity. Quickly he gathered a group around him. The majority were young men and women, and secretly taught them that promiscuous intercourse between the sexes was a doctrine believed in by the Latter-day Saints. When they asked how such could be possible, when they had heard Joseph preach much against polygamy, Bennett had a ready answer. He claimed that he was in a position to know exactly what was going on because he was boarding at Joseph's home and was acting as a temporary member of the first presidency in place of Sidney Rigdon, who was ill. He explained to them that Joseph was preaching so much against polygamy because of the prejudice of the public and Emma's strong opposition to that doctrine. Emma's opposition to polygamy was well known by the Saints. Bennett's assurances were so convincing that his secret circle of friends accepted his lies as truth, and they began practicing spiritual wifery. Among those ensnared in his web were Sarah Pratt, wife of Apostle Orson Pratt, Nancy Rigdon, daughter of Sidney, Chauncey and Francis Higbee, sons of church historian Elias Higbee, and others. After Joseph, Emma, and Hiram discovered this underground clique, they worked feverishly to eradicate Bennett's falsehood that Joseph had received a polygamous revelation and was practicing polygamy. But its roots had already gone too deep when Apostle Brigham Young and others, who favored polygamy, returned to Nauvoo from their missions to the British Isles in the summer of 1841. They found Bennett's foundation in place. After Bennett left Nauvoo, his foundation served as a base for Brigham and others of the 12 to secretly continue that false doctrine and practice. Between then and the time they left Nauvoo in 1846, Brigham and his many relatives and friends created their own secret inner circle wherein polygamy was practiced. They used Bennett's same wicked claim that Joseph had received polygamous revelations and was practicing polygamy, but was publicly denouncing it because of the prejudice of the public and Emma's opposition. Without Bennett's groundwork, Brigham could not have introduced polygamy into the church as an official doctrine. After August 1852, when Brigham made public his polygamous document, now Section 132 of the LDS Doctrine and Covenants, and claimed it had originally been received by Joseph, Brigham faced the enormous task of giving proof that Joseph was its author. Therefore, Bennett's claim of polygamous revelations to Joseph and charges that Joseph had plural wives became the main defense for Brigham and his followers. Joseph's sons declared the secrecy theory absurd. The belief that Joseph taught and practiced polygamy, but did it secretly because he feared opposition, is a ridiculous, weak belief according to Joseph's sons, Joseph III, Alexander, and David. Joseph Smith III was 11 and a half years old at the time of his father's death. The young lad had a deep respect for and a close relationship with his father. He was intelligent and studious and knew more about the polygamy conspiracy against his father than most saints, because he often witnessed his mother and father's joint work to counteract the false polygamous charges which Bennett had made. He had the opportunity to observe his father's behavior, language, and mindset in public and private, both in the prophet's office and home. As an example, the father required that Joseph III sometimes accompany him upon the rostrum during worship services, and the boy stayed at least once with his father while the prophet was in hiding. Joseph III had this to say in answer to Brigham Young and others' claims that his father kept a polygamous revelation and polygamous marriages secret because of fear of the public. To assert that Joseph Smith was afraid to promulgate that doctrine, polygamy, if the command to do so had come from God, is to charge him with the moral cowardice to which his whole life gives the lie. Nor does it charge him alone with cowardice, but brands his compeers with the same undeserved opprobrium. This very fact that men are now found who dare to present and defend it is proof positive that Joseph and Hyrum Smith would have dared to do the same thing had they been commanded so to do. The danger to the lives of those men would have been no more imminent, nor any greater in the preaching of celestial marriage than it was in preaching the Golden Bible and the doctrine that Joseph Smith was a prophet blessed with divine revelation. For the preaching of these tenets, many lost their lives. Joseph and Hyrum Smith were repeatedly mobbed, were imprisoned, and finally died in the faith originally promulgated, but, if we may judge from their public records, not believers in polygamy. Joseph III, Reply to Orson Pratt, Tract 4. Alexander Hale Smith, the son of the prophet, was 6 years old when his father was slain. After studying the polygamous charges against his father, he wrote, "We also learn another fact, that in the brain of the J.C. Bennett was conceived the idea, and in his practice was the principle first introduced into the church, and from this hellish egg was hatched the present degrading, debasing, and destructive polygamic system, known as spiritual wifery, or the celestial marriage so called. It is said that Joseph Smith the martyr received a revelation revealing the celestial marriage and instituting plurality of wives. I have already examined the testimony of Joseph Smith concerning the marriage ceremony, and he declares that he knew of no other system of marriage than the one quoted from the Book of Doctrine and Covenants, 1835 Kirtland edition, 101. But one says, that was only a sham to blind the eyes of our enemies. Shame on the man or set of men who will thus willfully charge the two best men of the 19th century, the two prophets of the Most High God, with publishing to the church and to the public at large a lie, and signing their names to it. Oh, but it was done to save their lives. A very likely story when those two men had faced death and the world for 14 long years, preaching the word of God to the sin-cursed generation. No, no, it will not do. You must meet the truth with better weapons than that if you expect to make much of a battle. But besides all that, is it not written that he who seeks to save his life shall lose it, and he who loseth his life for my sake shall find it? And did not they know this? Yes, 1,000 times yes. It was their hope, their consolation in times of danger. Joseph's fight against polygamy is being ignored by the LDS Church. In spite of all that Joseph did to proclaim that he was not lying when he said that he had not a polygamous revelation, and that he was honest in his condemning of polygamy. Members of the LDS Church proclaim even to this day that Joseph did receive Section 132 and was a polygamist. Joseph's side of the story has been and is being purposely ignored by the LDS Church. They never give Joseph credit for having spoken the truth on this subject. In fact, they consider it was necessary and acceptable for the prophet to lie. Even though the scriptures teach that lying is a major sin, it is ridiculous to believe that Joseph lied about polygamy because he feared a prejudiced public. For even the Mormons published that Joseph bravely faced death at Carthage, saying, "I am calm as the summer's morning." When Joseph's statements against polygamy are taken at face value and are read with the realization that he was not a cowardly liar, an astounding fact becomes obvious: that it was Brigham and his pro-polygamous party that palmed a fraudulent polygamy conspiracy upon the saints, which has blighted the Latter-day Saint movement for over a century and a half. Stafford's testimony concerning Brigham's adulterous activities. 70, Thomas Stafford, who knew Brigham Young in both England and Nauvoo, testified that he had personal knowledge of Brigham's misconduct. Stafford's family lived in England in 1837 in the city of Stockport when they first heard the gospel preached and became acquainted with Apostle Brigham Young. They joined the church, moved to Manchester, and sailed for America on May 1, 1841. The family arrived at Nauvoo in the summer of 1842. At Nauvoo, Thomas and his brother Edwin were schoolmates and friends of Joseph Smith III. Both Thomas and Edwin later became ministers in a reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. On August 24, 1891, 70, Thomas Stafford wrote a letter to 70 Gomer R. Wells, telling of improper conduct which he had witnessed on the part of Brigham Young, both in England and in Nauvoo. Stafford wrote, "But I am finally convinced, as I was then, that Brigham Young was in adultery in Manchester, England, in the fall, winter, and spring of 1840 and 1841. Elizabeth Mayer is the person with whom Brigham was then committing adultery. My reasons are these. We lived next door to her under the same roof. This Elizabeth Mayer had a father and a brother who were gardeners. They took their dinners as they worked a long piece from home. After they had left for work, Brigham would step into the house. She would then lock the door and pull down the blinds and curtains, which to me was strange. He never came to see our folks, although not 5 steps apart, and when he left he was always in a hurry, and she never came to the door with him when he was leaving. This same thing occurred in Nauvoo with a woman in Brigham. Her name was Greenough. Her son was about my age. He was always driven out when Brigham came. The door was shut and curtains lowered. I was puzzled to know why he acted so. If he had a good heart and was engaged in the business of teaching the truth, why drive the boy out? Why not come also and see my mother, only a few steps apart? I am now and was then satisfied that he was in adultery in Manchester, England. The seeds of polygamy was sown, and Brigham the sower. I was present at a meeting in a grove at Nauvoo about 3 weeks before Joseph and Hiram were murdered, when Joseph made a public statement in the presence of 3,000 people that polygamy was being practiced secretly by some, that had crept into the church secretly and must be put down speedily or the church would be driven from Nauvoo. I am satisfied that Joseph was not in favor of it, polygamy, at all. Would swear to all I have stated. R.C. Evans, Autobiography of Elder R.C. Evans.